Okay, good. Please rise. We bow to the Buddha 3 times to show our respect. Right. First bow, second bow, and third bow. Amida. Please be seated. We could please join me together. Please join your palms together. We recite Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. The unsurpassed, profound, and wonderful Dharma is difficult to encounter in hundreds of millions of eons. I now see and hear it, receive and uphold it, and I vow to fathom the Tathagata's true meaning. All right. Again, just a reminder where we are in the Amida Sutra, continue to talk about the corruptions of views, corruption of afflictions, corruption of sentient beings. That's what we are. Okay. So talking about the corruptions of sentient beings, we got to talk about the precepts, the 10 precepts. So we're now up to the 8 precepts. The 8th precept is abstention from covetousness or tranquility. So that's tranquility is the positive counterpart of abstention from covetousness. So we, as you probably can guess from these precepts here, we start with the first 3 are the physical, the bodily precepts. And then the next 4 are the verbal, right? The precepts for verbal. Now, these 4 here are not meant to restrict us, but these 4 precepts, we should understand them as methods of communication, right? To help us to communicate so that we can cooperate to make this world a better place. So these precepts are not meant as restrictions, but they are meant for us to learn how to communicate with each other. And then now we're moving on to the mental precepts. Now these are more subtle, and because they require much more attention to keep them. So the 8th precept is abstention from covetousness or tranquility. These precepts here are not so much with bodily or vocal behavior, but they are inner attitudes, outer expressions of utmost importance. And the reason for this, because these precepts, the 8th and the 9th, are related to meditation. And the 10th precept, which the last one, which we will talk about it next time. We probably won't have enough time to cover today. The 10th precept has to do with wisdom. This is how the 10 precepts are related to the threefold study, right? Precepts, meditation, and wisdom. So you can see that by observing these precepts, we are preparing the ground for meditation. So it's not just not doing anything, being afraid of to do things to violate, but we should understand these precepts in a more positive term, that they are really, we are building a ground for meditation and then wisdom. The negative form of the 8th precept is abstention from covetousness or ahijja. And when we analyze this term, what it means is that it's very much, the term itself is related to meditation or contemplation, or to think about, to ponder, such as jhana, right? So it has its roots in the meditation term. Abhi means very much or greatly, this intense, the intensity of it. So abhi does mean intensity. Abhijja signifies a mental state of intense thinking upon a pondering, very, very focused pondering. And that signifies a mental state of covetousness. So the relationship between covetousness or greed is that there's intense focus on something. You want to acquire something. So that's the relationship between greed or covetousness and meditation. If you watch a lot of TV crime dramas, you will be familiar with the term premeditated murder. And this means that the murderer didn't just lose his temper, but he had somebody in mind, and he had plotting of how to get rid of that person. So meditation too is you focus on some object, whether it's mental object or some external object that you focus on. There is a very interesting story in China, and this was back during it's called the spring and autumn period, where China was divided into 3 countries, and they fought. Each warlord of the countries fought each other to gain power over China. So it was a very interesting period. It was also, you could say, it's the worst of time and the best of times, because even though there were a lot of people who died from the wars, but there were a lot of innovations, literary innovations and technological innovations, to preserve their existence. So during the spring autumn period, which was between 770 BC, before Common Era, to 476, so this was way before the Common Era. In 1496 BCE, there was an emperor who was he was enthroned because of his predecessor passed away. So it's called I'll call him TC. Okay, Gao Ding, TC. We'll call him TC. So he became emperor of the southern part of China. And then on the Wu dynasty, upon hearing this news, he wanted to attack this new emperor. So the emperor of the Wu dynasty attacked CT, but unfortunately he was shot by an arrow in battle. And before he died, he told his son, Fusai, we call him PS. He told his son to take revenge for being killed in battle. And so PS went back and developed his country's military powers for 3 continuous years. And upon hearing this, CT, having defeated his father, thinking that he could again defeat his new enemy, CT. But against the advice of his CT's trusted advisor, he went in battle because he underestimated his new opponent's military power. So he took 5,000 of his troops towards to the Wu dynasty. Unfortunately, PS was able to surround CT and defeated CT. Now CT formed a council of war, asking his advisor what to do next because he was about to be defeated. His advisor told him that PS, this person on the right-hand side, was a very corrupted man, but yet he could be bought with flattery. So the advisor told CT to surrender. The best thing he could do was to surrender, be humble, and seek diplomacy with PS. So CT went to PS begging for mercy. Don't kill me, man. I have wife and kids at home. So PS decided not to kill CT and brought him back to his country as a slave. For 3 years, PS humiliated CT as revenge for his father, right? And for 3 years, CT on the left-hand side endured the humiliation and abuse. What he did was he slept on thorny logs and tasting the the bitterness, dripping fluids from gallbladder. It's very bitter stuff, right? To remind himself that the pain, the suffering, and humiliation through this pain and bitterness. And so CT continued to endure that. And one day, PS on the right-hand side was ill and gravely concerned of his illness. What CT did next was unheard of. He said he volunteered to taste the excrement of PS to determine the severity of the illness. He said that a sweet-like taste would indicate a serious illness, and a bitter taste would indicate not so serious but normal kind of illness. So from this, that CT earned the trust of PS. And later on, PS agreed to release CT, allowing him to return to his country. And this would be PS's great mistake, but of course he did not notice that at that time. For 10 years, while back in his country, CT worked hard to improve the economy of his country and secretly survived his country's military power for 10 years, while pretending to still be loyal to PS, right, as a nearby country. So in the meantime, CT gave PS his gift, his most beautiful concubine, as a gift to PS. Now, we'll call her, her name is Dai Ti, but we'll call her TT. TT was not only a beautiful concubine, but was also a mole to spy for CT. Slowly, she caused internal conflicts because of her beauty and jealousy within the Wu dynasty, and reported back to CT of suitable situations for the next attack. PS was distracted and seduced by TT the whole time, and he began to neglect his duties and his country, the people of his country. So based on the reports from TT, the beautiful concubine, that CT planned his attacks on the Wu dynasty. After 3 times attacking PS, in November 1473 BCE, PS was weakened and captured. Not accepting defeat, PS cut his own throat with a sword and took his own life. And that was also the end of the Wu dynasty. He was the last emperor of the Wu dynasty. So you could see that CT was very focused and meditative, you could say, on revenge, and hatred for the humiliation. But PS was also very focused and meditative on the beauty of TT. So the correlation between covetousness, greed, and meditation is that there is an intense focus on something. In the case of covetousness, there is an intense focus on acquiring something that one desires. So there is a simulation. There is a very powerful driving force to acquire something, right? So the terms, there are 3 terms that are related to this very powerful, intense driving force, and they are lobha, tana, and raga. Lobha means greed, lust, longing, or desire. Tana means thirst for something, from a root meaning dryness. And while raga means excitement, a passion, right? Usually when there is a lot of emotion involved, there's a drive. For example, we sometimes, in fact, you can say most of the times, we buy things out of emotion. We know that a particular device, like a Samsung, has better features, has better memories, has more memories, more features, but you rather buy an iPhone, right? Because an iPhone is more attractive, and you are sold on the fact that an iPhone is safer, right? It's very secure. Of course, the incident many years ago with the San Bernardino police who tried to hack the iPhone, and Apple would not give up the encryption, decryption, right? So they stood by their product. So from that they start to gain the trust of the public, that people would rather to buy an iPhone, even though it's more expensive, less memory, but yet you have that trust. So that's emotions, right? Sometimes we make decisions, our emotions. So what this means is that emotion is very powerful. We should leverage our emotion to achieve our means, of course, skillful means, right? If you have a positive goal that you want to achieve, you want to not only put your intellect, but your emotion in it. Your intellect and emotion should be in sync. And that is how you have this powerful, intense driving force to get towards your destination, right? So what kind of mental state is this? Covetousness. Well, it is a state essentially in which the self or the ego reaches out towards with a view of appropriating, of acquiring, incorporating, and fulfilling its own inner poverty and emptiness, right? Our heart is not only dry, but it's empty. And so we want to reach out to fill it, the emptiness in our heart, right? Greedy people will not feel that they have enough. They never feel they have enough, right? Even though they have millions of dollars in a bank account, they still don't feel enough. So that's a sign of greed. Of course, the extremity of greed is called the realm of hungry ghosts, right? They are never satisfied. No matter how much they have, they can never be satisfied. They don't know what they have. And in extreme cases, what they have eventually, that they appropriated eventually ends up burning them. There is a famous story in Chinese Buddhism of Moggallana, was the second chief disciple of the Buddha. When he was in meditation after his mother passed away, he entered meditation and he realized that his mother was suffering in the realm of hell or hungry ghost. And she was suffering. She didn't have anything to eat, and she was in great suffering. Of course, that was because due to her greed, covetousness, extreme covetousness when she was alive. And in his meditation, he saw that, and so he felt very hurt, of course. So he used his supernatural ability, what he was known for, to bring a bowl of his rice, of offering that he collected, down to that realm to feed his mother. She was so greedy and selfish that upon receiving her son's offering, she immediately covered it with her arms and did not want to share her food with anybody or the surrounding suffering beings, hungry ghosts around her. And because she was feared that they would eat all her food and that her food would be stolen. And so when she was covering her food and she picked the food and put it in her mouth, the food immediately burst into flame and burned her and causing even more suffering. And so Moggallana went back to the Buddha and asked for a way to help her mother. Even his supernatural ability could not help his own mother. But eventually, the Buddha gave or instructed him to have this festivity of givings to the monks, and to honor, to give the monks, that they would invite all the monks that they know. That's the tradition that's been passed down. So every year, probably in this month, July, of course, July, the lunar July calendar month, they would invite monks from nearby temples to have this offering, and then dedicate the merits to their loved ones to alleviate the suffering. So that's from that story that the traditions continue. So the more that people, the more that greed that they have, the more that they need, and therefore they never have enough. And this eventually becomes perpetual frustration, right? You continue to pursue something that you never have. It leads to perpetual frustration. So what this means here is that it's not what you have that you feel enough, but whether you feel enough is really in your mind, right? Even one piece of clothing is enough to make a person happy. A person who doesn't know what he or she has, even with an empire of treasures, he can never be happy, right? There is another famous story in China during the Shang Dynasty, the Zhou Emperor and the ivory chopsticks. Very interesting story. So one time the Zhou Emperor was given a pair of ivory chopsticks. Of course, ivory is very precious, right? It's come from the tusk of an elephant. So ivory chopstick, when he received this, his advisor looked at the emperor's eyes and realized that disaster was about to come, because when he looked at the ivory chopsticks, his eyes were filled with greed, wanting something more. So the advisor told the emperor that you should throw these chopsticks away because these chopsticks are cursed. But the emperor says, how can these chopsticks can be cursed? How are they cursed? They're just, chopsticks. I'm a powerful man in the country. How can anybody take me down? But of course, he didn't listen to his advisor. So when he has this chopstick, and he wanted to use a chopstick with his meal, to take his meals. And so when he was taking his meal, he realized that these chopsticks here don't match the bowl that he has, his bowls. And so he said, I need to change this bowl because I need to have matching pairs, right? I have beautiful chopsticks, very precious chopsticks. I need to have matching bowls to go with my chopsticks. So he ordered to have another ivory bowl to accompany the chopsticks. So the next meal that he had, he looked at his bowls and his chopsticks, say, this table does not match this pair of chopsticks and bowl. So he ordered to have this ivory table made of ivory for him to match it. Of course, the next meal was like, no, this setting here does not match. I need this house. This house does not match with the table and the ivory bowl and chopsticks. So of course, one thing led to another. The more that he wanted, he was so absorbed and distracted by materialism that he forgot and neglected his duties and his people. Of course, that brought to the downfall of his, to his kingship, right? So that is a state called dukkha in Buddhism. Dukkha is not a state of suffering, but dukkha is a state of restrictions as opposed to liberation, right? So dukkha is not just suffering. That's how people understand it. But we should understand dukkha to be a state of restriction, imprisonment, mental imprisonment. You can never be satisfied. You can never be free. You can never have enough. So there's always a perpetual frustration in us when we are in a state of dukkha, right? So that's how it is. That's how it is to live with covetousness, is that you can never be happy. You can never be enough, right? Does it make sense? Right. The next, for this reason, the term abhijja or covetousness is often combined with the term distress, dejectedness, melancholy, or grief. And that's usually accompanied when we have frustration because of greed. So that state of general existential polarization between coveting subject and coveted object, where you wanting something that you cannot have, so that frustration continues to build. So how do we overcome this? Well, one way is to observe the positive counterpart of covetousness. And usually that is associated with abandoning covetousness for generosity. But generosity is not really radical enough to overcome covetousness. And so, but really one way is really to practice generosity, to give up. But to give up, to detach sounds kind of negative. Because we want to achieve this state of depolarization. A state of polarization is a struggle, right, between what you want and that you don't get. So the author here is saying, well, contentment has already been used. We already used that with abstention from sexual misconduct. So the author here is suggesting perhaps the counterpart of this is tranquility, right? Tranquility is just to, in a way, to let go in a positive sense. So we shouldn't take this state of tranquility to be passive, but it's very positive that you actively want to not only harbor, you don't want to harbor what you have, but you want to give away what you have. And this is not easy. Greed comes naturally in everybody, right? We don't have to practice. We don't have to learn to be greedy. It comes naturally. But to practice generosity or tranquility, it takes practice. So, but why does it require practice to perform generosity? Well, the notion of needing to practice suggests that it is difficult. It's very difficult. And the reason that it is difficult because it goes against our egoistic nature. It goes against our nature. Greed does not need encouragement because it's being naturally pushed by our own ego to be greedy, which in a sense the ego wants to ensure that its survival continues. So it wants to secure as much resource as possible, right? So it's very natural for one to secure many resources to ensure its survival. So therefore, it does not need encouragement. But generosity involves giving away, right? Giving away your resources, giving away your time, your energy, and that goes against the tendency of the ego, and that's why it is difficult. So if we want to be mundane beings, it's very easy. We just continue to follow our own ego. But if we want to transcend the state of mundane beings, in other words, sagehood, to become sages, to become wise beings, we have to overcome our ego. And that's where the difficulty is. That struggle is not natural. That struggle is difficult, and it takes a lot of determination. So it should be clear by now that the connection between the 8 precepts and meditation, between the 3 mind precept and meditation, it should be obvious, right? That's an intense focus. One is intense focus to acquire something. The other is intense focus on the object of meditation. So meditation is, in a way, is a method of raising the level of consciousness, the level of awareness. Right? We have our fundamental rudimentary awareness, which is what animalistic. We have this awareness, and then it requires some part in yourself to have your self-awareness and to be aware of your surrounding. But it requires a next level is called transcendental awareness, and that's where meditation can help us to achieve. So when you practice meditation, it's not just about feeling good, right? Feeling happy, feeling joyful, but it's about raising your awareness, developing and going beyond, go to the next level of awareness. Since consciousness is made up of various mental states, therefore we have many methods of meditation. For example, there are people who are very attracted to wealth. There are people who are attracted to fame, to sex, food, drinks, and rest. Right? There are people when they're attracted to wealth, they don't care about fame. For example, they just want to enjoy their wealth, but it takes a lot of effort to be popular because you have to put in a lot of effort to go out there to sell your popularity. That takes too much work. So they're not very attracted to fame, but they are very attracted to money. All right. Or people who care about food. They like to eat. They don't care about whether they have money or not. As long as there's delicious food on the table for them, that's all they care about. Or people who like to sleep all day. They don't care about fame. Who cares? Who wants to be famous, right? Who cares about having millions of dollars in the bank account? They just want to be able to rest peacefully. So to them, rest is the best thing. And some scientists even believe that rest or sleep is the best thing that one can do to improve one's survival or quality of being, quality of life. So different people have different attraction, I guess. That's why there are various mental states, and that's why we have many ways of practicing meditation. So meditation has a number of specific forms, working depending on our particular unskillful mental state that we want to overcome. Covetousness is a state of reaching out, right, of the self or the ego towards the non-self to acquire something. And to eradicate covetousness is to realize its futility. There's no use. In other words, there's no use in acquiring something because it will only lead to restriction, not freedom. It will only lead to suffering, dissatisfaction. Because the more that you have, the more fear you will have, right? So with that kind of thinking, it helps to reduce covetousness. So it is essentially telling your mind and convincing yourself that it's pointless and meaningless in chasing after your objects of desire, right? Because it's not easy. It's easier said than done because the mind is very powerful. Therefore, to overcome it, we have to have this, not only our logic, but our emotion has to be convinced as well. So in other words, we can learn about it, we know about it, but when it comes to practice, we don't follow through. And that is because we are not emotionally convinced that it is pointless. In fact, we may say it's pointless, but in our mind, emotionally, we're saying, hey, this is the best thing that can happen to me, right? So there are several meditations to help eradicate covetousness. One is recollection of death or impurity on the 6 elements. Now, recollection of death does not mean that we lapse into pessimism, but this is being realistic, because death is very realistic. People say that they are realistic, but when it comes to death, they don't want to talk about it, right? So, so they're not very realistic when it comes to death. Everything else, yes, they're very realistic, down to earth. But when it comes to death, nope, it's not even part of their consideration. I mean, reality is that there will be old age, grief, and death in every one of us. And those are facts of life. We can accept these facts and still be positive, right, about these things without seeing through a rosy mist or refusing to face unpleasant facts. We don't have to trick our mind, fool our mind into thinking that, yeah, as long as I learn Buddhism, I'm free from all affliction, I'm free from all kind of pain. And that's not true. What we learn doesn't mean that there is fertility in learning Buddhism. What Buddhism allows us is that we can gain from Buddhism. In other words, our body will have pain, but there is no suffering. There is a big difference. The body will have pain. You will have toothache, you will have headache, but there is no suffering. Does it make sense? Right? Suffering is many times painful. For example, You walk down the street, and of course, nowadays it's traditional or to walk and look on your phone at the same time, right? I guess it has become a tradition because you see it all over the place. And then you accidentally trip. If it was all by yourself, you wouldn't feel hurt. But it was in front of people that you care, the pain is 10 times more, right? So that's suffering, and it's no longer pain, but it's suffering, because after the incident, you keep thinking about it. Oh man, what a fool I made of myself, and I've lost my opportunity now to impress my, or whatever, right? Your or whoever that you are trying to attract. So you continue to think about it. It costs you suffering. It costs you to be sleepless. It costs you to be tired. It costs you to all kinds of issues, and then you have anxiety. So that is suffering. But that pain was momentary, but the suffering linger on, right? So when we learn Buddhism, there will be pain. I can guarantee you. But if you learn Buddhism properly, there is no suffering. Does it make sense? Right? So that's one big distinction that we should understand. So when we say that, yes, there is pain, we are being realistic. But when we say there is no suffering, that means we have a solution to that problem, right? So growing old is realistic, and we should face those facts of old age, grief, and death, right? And we should acknowledge them. And we should find solutions for those things, to find solutions to those problems. And we should go beyond them. And of course, we should be non-attached. And in a positive sense, not to let go, but to resolve them. Right? We resolve problems, not run away from problems. So what you lack in physical strength, you can make up for it in spirituality or in your mental state. And in fact, being spiritual and mental brings more value to yourself. And we see this with Stephen Hawking, who passed away, or even other famous scientists, although they are physically weak. For Stephen Hawking, in his case, he lost all of his muscles except for one muscle in his cheek that he used, and people built a computer for him to communicate. So he lost all of his muscle. You could say he was probably the weakest man alive, but yet he was very well respected because of his mentality, his ability to think, right? So physical strength, although it's great, but what people value is your intelligence, right? Your mentality, right? So that carries more weight. Of course, the best combination is to have great physique and also great mentality, intelligence, right? We want to cultivate those things. But we should be realistic and face the truth and not run away from the truth. And of course, reflecting on death, on purity of the body, allows us to eradicate craving. Focusing on purity, for example, nobody wants spoiled, rotten food, right? So when you imagine that, why would you fight over rotten food with somebody? It makes no sense. So from that perspective, it makes it less attractive. It reduces the craving. So this may sound a little bit drastic, right? To be reflecting on death, to reflecting on decomposing corpse, but it is a very powerful counteracting agent to overcome craving. And you look closely at what death does to a human body, you would think to yourself, this is what will happen to me. One day I will look like that body with my body swollen, stinking, my head hanging off here, my arms lying over there like that body, my and my ashes. Eventually, that's what I will turn into. So it helps to think that way, but it may not be for everybody because it is very drastic. But of course, if your covetousness is intense, then you want to use drastic action. So again, it depends on the strength of that particular affliction, mental affliction, that you want to get rid of. The sight of decomposing corpse may give rise to feelings of disgust, revulsion, and may not be very suitable for everybody, because it can literally make you sick, and it may not have any impact on your spirituality at all. So it can work against you, but it's very powerful. And for some people, they are sensitive enough where they don't need to absorb a swollen corpse, but by looking at a falling leaf is enough to remind them of impermanence, that things change. I should make it clear that people often understand impermanence with death, but that's only one perspective of looking at impermanence. Impermanence is change, right? Without impermanence, we cannot change for the better. So we use impermanence we associate impermanence with death only for expedience of it, and that's not the whole meaning, right? We should look at the entirety of that meaning that includes the positivity and negativity. We utilize impermanence to change for the better, because without impermanence, we will be stuck in this state forever with our suffering. And when that is the case, then life will be unbearable, right? But it helps to remind us that things can decay very fast. I mean, when you drive on the road and you see bits and pieces of corpses, like that of dogs or rabbits or whatever, right? or birds on the street that cars have run over, it may not inspire you towards any kind of spirituality. It may even make you feel unpleasant, but it depends on how sensitive you are. You may feel sorry for the animals, but it may not have any kind of impact on you. Okay. But what this does is it helps to break up our present individuality or ego. We tend to see our own body as in entirety, as permanent, unchanging entity. We believe that we are one single entity, but when we observe impermanence, it helps to break us down to the 5 aggregates, the 5 skandhas, that we are not any single. We are not the arms. We are not, the hands, but we are made up of so many constituents that there's no one single constituent that would say, this is me, right? And so that helps to break down that individuality. And when we learn the principle of sunyata, which is emptiness, that's what it is helping us to realize, that we are not one single entity, but it's made up of different entities. You can visualize on the 6 elements. The 6 elements that we are currently borrowing the 6 elements, and eventually we'll have to give back the 6 elements to the universe. So here's a poem from the author. I am earth, I am rock, metal, and soil. I am that which exists in you, as bone, muscle, and flesh. But now I must go, leaving you light. Now we must part. Goodbye. I am water, I am ocean, lake, rivers, and streams, the rain that falls from clouds, and the dew on the petals of flowers. I am that which exists in you, as blood, urine, sweat, saliva, and tears. But now I must go, leaving you dry. Now we must part. Goodbye. I am fire. I come from the sun, traveling through space to sleep in wood, flint, and steel. I am that which exists in you, as bodily heat, the warmth of an embrace. But now I must go, leaving you cold. Now we must part. Goodbye. I am air. I am wind, breeze, and hurricane. I am that which exists in you as the breath in your nostrils, in your lungs, the breath that gently comes, that gently goes. But now I must go for the last time, leaving you empty. Now we must part. Goodbye. I am space. I contain all, from a grain of dust to a galaxy. I am that which exists in you, as the space limited by the earth, water, fire, and air that make up your physical being. But now they have all gone, and I must go too, leaving you unlimited. Now we must part. Goodbye. I am consciousness, undefinable and indescribable. I am that which exists in you, as sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and thought. But now I must go from the space no longer limited by your physical being, leaving nothing of you. There is no one from whom to part. So, goodbye. Earth dissolves into water. Water dissolves into fire. Fire dissolves into air. Air dissolves into space. Space dissolves into consciousness. Consciousness dissolves into So we should understand that we are made of these elements, and we are just borrowing them. And by reflecting on that, it allows us to understand that we are not one permanent, unchanging self, right? So we should. So this 8th precept here is not only to avoid greed or covetousness, but to have tranquility and to practice generosity. And when we practice generosity, we are going beyond the self, the ego. And in order to have the state of transcendence, we have to go beyond the ego, right? The attitude of letting go of unskillfulness in appropriating objects of desire is essential in overcoming covetousness. Meditation can help to reduce the unskillful desires. Here, you should understand that we're not letting go all desires, just unskillful desires. There are some desires that we still need to maintain, like desires for transcendence, desire for compassion, desire for wisdom. Those are healthy desires that we should maintain, because without those desires, there is no motivation, right? That will help us to achieve those very positive mental states. And so we should be realistic. We should face unpleasant facts of life without being pessimistic. The fruit of cultivation is far more than the relative joy and suffering that we encounter. And so the purpose of the 8th precept is to help us to overcome mundane desires. That will only lead to suffering, to dissatisfaction. But instead, we should strive to achieve the state of the transcendence, which is infinitely more meaningful. So if one is prevented from getting what one desires, it can lead to anger. And that is the 9th precept. So one difference that between the 8th and 9th precept is that in the 8th precept with greed is that you want to reach out to acquire something. But when you are being prevented from acquiring your object of desire, it leads to anger, right? So that's the 9th precept, which is abstention from hatred or anger, but to practice compassion. That's the positive counterpart. So we look at the term, the term vyapada, I believe. We will look at this term. It is synonymous with making bad or doing harm or desire to injure, hatred, anger. So that's what this state of being involves. Is a very negative state a state of mentality that you want to hurt somebody, you want to inflict pain. Vyadi means sickness, malady, illness, or disease. So in general sense, the word is related to ill will or wishing evil. And there are terms that closest related to this hatred, the word hatred. One is called dosa. Dosa is anger or ill will or evil intention. And koda is simply anger. And vara is enmity. So the real nature of unskillful mental state, of this mental state, of the ninth precept, emerges only when one is able to see the connection between hatred and covetousness, greed. Covetousness. If covetousness is a state in which the self reaches out to acquire something, to appropriate something, and to incorporate it, hatred then is a state arises when that movement of reaching out is hindered or obstructed. Right? You are not satisfied. You are angry because you are being prevented of trying to from acquiring what you want to acquire. If covetousness is the primary psychological formation, then hatred is the secondary one. That follows. It is the murderous wish to do the utmost possible harm or damage to whatever interposes itself between coveting subject and coveted object. So if something comes between you and your object of desire, and there will be hatred, there will be anger. So the positive counterpart here of hatred is not love, but compassion, because love has already been used, so we don't want to repeat ourselves. But the real reason why compassion rather than love is it can be found in the Bodhisattva ideal. According to a sutra called Questions of the Arhat Upali, the sutra says that for a bodhisattva to break precepts out of desire is a minor offense, even if he does so for innumerable kalpas, eons of ages. Whereas for him to break precepts out of anger, even once, is a serious offense. Bodhisattvas who breaks the precepts out of desire still holds sentient beings in his embrace. Right? He still wants to preserve the existence of sentient beings, things around him. Whereas a bodhisattva who breaks precept out of hatred forsakes sentient beings altogether. He just wants to destroy everything. And that completely goes against bodhisattva ideal, compassion. Right? At least compassion, or you have some sort of positivity in life, there is still a sense of trying to preserve something. Whereas on the negative side, you just want to completely obliterate everything, and that is not consistent with compassion. It's not consistent with the bodhisattva ideal. Here we're not encouraging people to break the precepts on a positive term. We don't want to break any precepts at all. Of course, again, right? We're not encouraging people to break precepts, but this is really the wisdom of bodhisattva here, to be able to break a precept to save sentient beings. There's a famous story of a hunter chasing after a rabbit, and of course the rabbit was much faster and farther away, and when he came to a corner, he lost sight of the rabbit, but then he saw a monk sitting there, ascetic, sitting there meditating. So he asked the ascetic which way the rabbit went. Of course, he was sitting there, so he knew exactly where the rabbit went. But instead of pointing to that way where the rabbit ran, he pointed to the opposite direction. So in other words, he was lying to the hunter. but because out of compassion to save the rabbit's life, but also to prevent the hunter from committing killing, he lied. Of course, he had to face retribution for his lie, but out of compassion that he was willing to, to face the retribution. There may be pain. Let's say he may be slandered for, as an effect, the consequence of his lie, but he did not feel any suffering. Does it make sense? So when our compassion, we may do something that seems to break the precepts, but our compassion, there is positivity to prevent the negative effect overall. So we're combining positivity and negativity, but the magnitude of positivity is much greater than the negativity. So overall, the effect is small. Just like you have salt and water in a bowl, you put more water, they make it more diluted. There is still salt in it, but you don't taste the saltiness of it, right? You can still drink without without feeling even more thirsty. Hatred and compassion are mutually exclusive. You cannot hate somebody at the same time have compassion for them, because hatred is, in this case, you cannot have a mind to want to hurt somebody, inflict great pain. At the same time, you have compassion for them. The forms of meditation, which we have the effect of checking the hatred or preventing hatred from arising, we can practice, for example, the four immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Right? We practice that's called visualizations on compassion. Loving kindness is to alleviate the suffering and to give them joy. Loving kindness is to give them happiness. Compassion is to alleviate their suffering. Because in order to encourage somebody to do good, you need to first alleviate their suffering, and then they will have ability to think about other people positively. And then sympathetic joy here is when you see somebody who is successful, that you don't get jealous, but you feel joy, you have joy for them. And even joy is not ultimate. It has to lead you to equanimity or tranquility, where you even let go of that joy. Otherwise, you get stuck, and you'll be in this vicious cycle where instead of transcending that cycle of inflicting pain and then realizing there is something better, which is joy, but you cannot get out of that cycle, you will be inflicted with jealousy, and then it takes you back in that vicious cycle where you want to hurt somebody again. And when you hurt them, you feel sorry for them, you want to alleviate their suffering, and you feel happy that they are better, but then you become jealous because they are now much better than you. So you get stuck in that cycle, and that's why we need to have equanimity, tranquility, to overcome that, to not become attached. Another way is to practice rejoicing merits. Once hatred has been eradicated, one can then proceed to deal with the underlying state of covetousness that makes hatred possible. For craving is fertile ground that allows the seed of hatred to grow. So craving is very fundamental for unskillfulness. We can learn about visualizations on compassion, which is a very effective antidote to hatred. During meditation, we talked about metta for oneself, to reinforce. This helps to reinforce the positivity in oneself. Be kind to yourself. Give the positivity that you need. And only when you are positive can you be positive towards others. So even though we're practicing the bodhisattva idea where we want to be selfless, but first we have to be happy and positive first. So we should not just ignore ourselves, but part of saving all sentient being includes us. So we should not forget about ourselves. So once we are truly positive, then we can direct that loving kindness towards friends and family. And then this is much easier because it's much easier to reciprocate loving kindness towards those who are kind to you, right? And this allows you to be realistic and pragmatic. Friendship requires trust, openness, patience, and empathy. So that means you have to spend time with them and develop that relationship. And of course, this is not easy because it requires patience, it requires experience and kindness on your part to be with them, to develop that. But because they are your loved ones, it's much easier to reciprocate that understanding, that loving kindness. Now, when we develop metta, it's not emotional, selfish, emotional kind of state of being, because metta is different from pema. Pema is attachment kind of love, including sexual attraction. So that's not pema because it can lead to jealousy. But metta is you can be very kind, generous to your friend, your partner, even your family, but without that selfishness in it, right? So normally in relationships, people are seeking security. So it's really an exchange. It's a contract to be with each other, and that's mundane emotions. That's not metta. People stay together because of the needs that they need each other. But once those needs are no longer met, then they move on. So that's not metta, right? That's pema. So metta here is that there is no exclusivity, but it doesn't mean that you just go around and share your love. That's not what is meant here. But it's you invest your time, your energy to develop that loving kindness, that relationship. Here we're talking about a higher step, right? We rising above self-interest. And when we can do that, we are ready for the next level, and that is to care for somebody who you have no interest in, to care for strangers, neutral persons, people that you may have crossed paths in the supermarket, your cashier that you don't know about, or postal office workers that you don't know about, but you care for somebody that you don't know about, right? So that's the next level up. And that allows you to be ready for even a more challenging level, and that is to care for somebody who you hate, your enemy, your foes. And because that is requires much more patience, more practice to care for somebody who you dislike very much. And because it requires you to transform your reactive mind, your negative emotions, and convert those negativity into positivity. Because metta is positivity. Loving kindness is positivity. So it takes a lot of work, energy to convert that negativity into positivity. This is why it's put at the last level. Not the last level, but a level that's after the other two. First, you develop positivity in yourself, and then you radiate it to reciprocate that loving kindness to those who you love, and then strangers you don't care about, which, like, why would anybody want to care for somebody who you don't care about, you don't know about, right? So that's the mundane way of thinking. And then when you have established that, then you now have a much more ability to love for somebody who hurts you, who even wants to hurt you, right? So it requires much more energy. And then the last one is metta for all sentient beings. This allows one to heighten and transform consciousness and not be limited by time and space. So this requires even more energy to encompass all sentient beings, visible or invisible. Achieving, and so this may not be specific, but certainly not woolly. When we say all sentient beings, we're not being just general just for the sake of it, but this really requires a lot of wisdom because how can you have compassion for something or somebody that you don't even see, like completely not very realistic. So it requires a lot at this level. But bring it back to earth, when we practice positivity, such as like compassion, we ourselves will be positive. So that is already a benefit, right? By practicing loving kindness, because without, I mean, if you can have positivity in your life, that is already a benefit, right? So, but that by itself is a benefit. So rejoice in merits. Let's take a look at that. What this means to practice rejoicing in merits. When we say rejoicing in merits or virtues, we talk about recollecting the noble lives of others, such as the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, or great spiritual leaders, or even renowned helpers of humanity, and even ordinary people who can influence us in a positive way, right? We are happy because of their existence, okay? Because they provide us enthusiasm, they provide us inspiration, allows us to reach our goals. And so we are happy because of their being. Rejoicing in merits counteracts unskillful mental states of such as jealousy, envy, pride, egotism. There should be no interest in deriving personal recognition from it. So even though we're joyful, but we don't, we don't, it's not for self-interest that we are joyful. Just like when we practice meditation and we have joy, it's not for our own joy, but joy is a natural byproduct. So we don't have to seek for it. It comes naturally. When we are in a positive state of mind, joy naturally comes. But if your focus is to have joy, joy will not come. There will be no positivity. Does it make sense? So the goal of meditation is to raise your level of awareness. Joy and comfort will come naturally. It's not the other way around. It's not like, let's say you have an itch and you want to scratch. It feels satisfying to scratch that itch. But if there's no itch, you shouldn't be scratching to hoping for that itch. It goes backwards, right? So when we sit in meditation, we should be focusing on raising or deepening our level of awareness, and not for the sake of joy. Does it make sense? Right? So when you have rejoice, when you rejoice in good deeds, you are glad that somebody has done something good, right? You may not be the one to perform the good deed, but at least somebody has done it, and so you applaud them for it, truly applauding them for it. And at the same time, you don't feel inferior because you are deprived of the opportunity to do good deeds. So again, there is positivity in it, but if you're clapping, you're applauding somebody, but if you're feeling bad about yourself, not to be the one to do the good deeds, then that is not rejoicing in merits. And you don't become oversensitive. You don't become over preoccupied with yourself. But then you really encourage others who have the ability to do so to do good deeds. you should rejoice in merits quite impersonally, not for any personal gain. Like you don't want to be kissing up to somebody, applauding them so that you can gain something later on. And you don't feel jealous, just like the sun shedding light on all beings that everybody can enjoy under the sunlight, the sunshine. So the one important psychological fact is that you cannot happy with others unless you are happy with yourself. If you're positive, then it's very easy to radiate that positivity. And sometimes what we see is really a reflection of what we radiate, just like light. We see the board, a certain color because of the light reflected to it, back to our eyes. So when we encounter an environment, people who we think are happy, they may not be necessarily happy, but because we are radiating happiness, and that happiness comes back to us, and that's what we see. Or when we encounter somebody that we don't like, and we have this hatred in us, it's not that there is anything in them that is hateful or deserving hatred, but what's coming back to us is what we are radiating. Does it make sense? So it takes some awareness to understand that. And so when we rejoice in something, when you are truly rejoicing in something, and it's coming back to you because you are fulfilling your heart with joy. That's how you can receive it. Does it make sense? So your feelings about yourself and your feelings about others are very intimately connected. People who are feeling guilty because they are out of touch with their own spiritual practice, and they find it very difficult to appreciate what others are doing. But when we are not being true to ourselves, and we don't follow through with our practice, we learn about compassion, about wisdom, but we don't put in practice what we learn, then we are not appreciating ourselves. We are not giving ourselves that positivity, right? We're not being kind to ourselves. So when we're not being kind and appreciative of ourselves, when we see other people practicing meditation, practicing compassion, and with wisdom, we have no appreciation for them. Does it make sense? So it comes back to us. So we are the source of our own problem. So they even sometimes adopt a resentful or highly critical attitude towards other people's efforts and find it impossible to rejoice in their merits. So this is why it's difficult, because it goes against the ego. If we continue to flow with the ego and not put in any efforts to overcome the ego, we will find rejoicing in merits to be very difficult, because we don't appreciate ourselves. We're not being kind to ourselves, and therefore we cannot receive the kindness, receive the appreciation, and we cannot appreciate what other people are doing. By contrast, if you see people who are genuinely, freely, and regularly rejoicing in the merits of others, you can be sure that they are very much at peace with themselves. If we can happily, peacefully applaud other people because they truly can do it, then we know for a fact of ourselves that we are very joyful. So you don't have to go out to do something great to feel great about yourself. The fact that you have no jealousy, you can rejoice in other people's merits, you are yourself already joyful, right? You are already complete in a sense. So you may be, of course, be doing what you ought to be doing and still not feel any sense of joy, because your practice is mechanical. You're If our practice is just mechanical, we just learn, but we don't put into practice, we don't have joy out of it. We cannot get joy out of it. And therefore, we cannot rejoice in other people's merits. So in this case, you may be doing the right things in an external sense only. We observe the precepts, we go to lectures, we practice meditation, but there is no joy in it. That's what's happening. So you go through the motions without the appropriate mental, emotional attitude, right? We're not changing ourselves. We're not deepening our awareness. We're not elevating our level of consciousness. We go through the motion, but we're not reaping any benefits from it. You are just being good. All the more resentful. Here I'm being good, but I don't seem to be getting any results from it. And nobody seems to be appreciating it. I'm not even feeling good. So that's mechanical practice, just going through the motion without understanding why. So we can always have skillful mental state, but before we can, in other words, we can now always be perfect, but at least we can tell ourselves that we have tried our best. Right? We will fall, we will trip, we will make mistakes, but we will learn from the mistakes. And if we can say that to ourselves, then I think that's very good already. So we must understand what is it that we're doing, why we're attending lectures, why we're meditating, why we are committed to this ideal, this very ideal of altruism, right? This ideal of egolessness, and why we're doing it, why we want to pursue it. Otherwise, we can end up losing touch with what we're doing and our feelings. So a person who is naturally in touch with his or her own feelings should be able to do this quite safely. But what if you are out of touch? What can you do? What are your options? One is that you shouldn't repress your emotions, but you shouldn't allow your emotions to overtake you. Acknowledge, okay, I don't live up to my own expectation, and I will do something about it. And it helps to surround yourself with positive people. So like a spiritual community is very beneficial because your environment can change your thinking. If you walk into a very positive environment, your negativity can be diluted, right, with the positivity. So without strongly developed positive emotions, you can't have much individual development. So it helps to be among those who we aspired to become, or to share at least on their positivity. So emotionally positive has two aspects. One is feeling happy with yourself, and the other is feeling happy with others. So it's something that you can tell yourself that you rejoice with delight in the good done by all beings through which they obtain rest with the end of suffering. May those who have suffered be happy. Right? And rejoice in your arising of the will of enlightenment. You have this very lofty goal, aspiration. Be joyful that you have found it. At least you have a goal. You have a sense of direction. You may not be there yet, but at least you have a sense of direction. And that is, I think that should be very positive in us already. Okay, some may conclude that this kind of goal is very out of touch of reality, because you look at society is not enlightened, and to expect enlightened society of enlightened individuals is just foolishness, because that's naivety. Well, because if we look at life, there's always, we see social injustice, right? And you see a lot of turmoil. And how can we expect the world to be selfless. So even though we want to be realistic, at the same time we also have this aspiration, and we can look at life, observe the facts that yes, there is injustice, there is inequality, but we don't have to do so with negativity. We can be positive without fooling ourselves, without being unrealistic. Right? So it does take a lot to be a bodhisattva, and that's what we're trying to do, is to overcome our own egoism, our own selfishness, and to have this metta, this compassion for all sentient beings. But we shouldn't be unrealistic. But it is really a reminder for us that a bodhisattva's work is never done. Right? We continue to work hard for the benefits of all sentient beings, including ourselves. So that's what the Buddha is. That's overcoming dualism. Dualism is you and me as two separate entities. But when we are resonating with bodhisattva ideals, we are overcoming that dualism. You and me, we are the same. Okay. All right, let's conclude what talked about today. We talked about 2 precepts, the 8th and the 9th precept. The 8th precept is abstention from covetousness, or the positive aspect of it is tranquility. We should avoid craving for mundane and meaningless objects, but which we know that will only lead to suffering and dissatisfaction. But we should be motivated. We should be motivated for something transcendental, infinitely more meaningful, which will subsequently, it will lead to unsurpassed joy. We don't have to look for joy. It will come naturally. So the 8th precept is to motivate us to crave for something that is meaningful, right? Not to stop craving, but to crave for something that is meaningful, that is beneficial to all sentient beings. The 9th precept is abstention from hatred or compassion. Selfish craving selfish craving that's being obstructed leads to hatred or anger. The antidote to that is to meditate on the 5 levels of metta that we just talked about, and rejoice in merits of others, right? To counteract our own negativity, our own jealousy. Life may be difficult. Human suffering may be endless, but we don't have to be negative in it. When we observe the facts, even a small flash of light is enough to shine in pitch darkness, right? So our compassion may be small, our abilities may be small, but it is very helpful and very much needed in today's society. And I'm sure society can use compassion, loving kindness. A lot of people feel neglected, feel lonely, because they don't appreciate themselves and they don't know what they have. And I'm sure that any little bit of compassion and loving kindness will go a long way. We've seen school shooting, because they did not have a way of expressing their anger, right? So the only way that they thought they could express their anger was to shoot at people, to gain some attention. Look at me, I'm suffering. Look at me, I need help. But nobody's listening. So the only way to do that is to cause a lot of pain so that people could listen to them. And that is a terrible way of seeking for help, right? So even a small flash of light, a small flash of compassion can be very helpful in the pitch darkness of evilness or of uncaring. So realize how precious is loving kindness when we reflect on what life would be like without it. right? So even our small amount of loving kindness may go unnoticed, but you imagine living in a society where there is no compassion, you can see how precious it can be, right? So before I leave, before we end, I will leave you with this poem. This is very common poem. If you search on the internet, you will see it. But I like to leave this with you. May all blessings be yours. May all gods protect you. May the power of all the Buddhas, by the power of all the Buddhas, may all happiness be yours. May all blessings be yours. May all gods protect you. By the power of all Dhammas, may all happiness be yours. May all blessings be yours. May all gods protect you. By the power of all the Sangha, may all happiness be yours. Amida. All right, let's do dedications. If you could please join your palms. Together we recite, may the merits and virtues accrued today adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the path below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, together we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss. If you could please rise, we bow to the Buddha 3 times to show our respect. First bow, second bow, and third bow. Now, Amida.